The sun went out at noon, in the middle of Jerusalem, for 3 hours. It didn't cloud over, it didn't darken slowly. It went out, as if someone had shut the eyes of the sky. Thousands of pilgrims filled the city for Passover, and suddenly, without warning, without clouds, without explanation, total night at 12 o'clock in the day. And what happens during the next 3 hours is so terrifying that even pagan historians who did not believe in Jesus recorded it. Phlegon of Thallus, a Greek historian from the 2nd century, wrote that in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, which corresponds exactly to the year 33 after Christ, there was darkness so dense at midday that the stars appeared in the sky. And he recorded a massive earthquake in Bithynia. Thallus, another historian, wrote about the same event barely 20 years after it happened. He tried to explain it as a solar eclipse, but Julius Africanus, who read Thallus, corrected him. A solar eclipse is impossible during a full moon, and the Jewish Passover always falls on a full moon. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was something else. And the question nobody asks is the most important one of all. What was God doing in that moment? Because the church taught you that Jesus died on the cross. They taught you that he suffered. They taught you that it was for your sins. But almost nobody explained to you what the Father was doing while his Son was dying, and what he did was not stay silent. What he did was so violent, so supernatural, and so loaded with prophetic meaning that every sign he produced that Friday was a message the priests of the temple understood perfectly, a message the Romans witnessed without being able to explain, a message that you today have probably never heard in full. And that is exactly what we are going to do right now, sign by sign, what God did and why. But before we enter the first sign, you need to understand something that changes the entire reading. In the 1st century Jewish mind, darkness was not simply the absence of light. Darkness was the presence of divine judgment. When you read Exodus 10, verses 21 through 23, the 9th plague upon Egypt was darkness, 3 days of shadow so dense that nobody could move. It was the second to last plague before the death of the firstborn. Joel 2, verse 31 says that the sun will turn into darkness before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Amos 8, verse 9 says it even more clearly. In that day, says the Lord, I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in the clear day. Did you catch that? The sun will go down at noon, exactly what happened at Golgotha. Amos wrote that 700 years before the crucifixion, and it was fulfilled with surgical precision. Matthew 27, verse 45. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land unto the 9th hour. The 6th hour is noon. The 9th hour is 3 in the afternoon. 3 hours of absolute darkness. But look at what Amos says right after in verse 10. And I will turn your feasts into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation. What feast were they celebrating in Jerusalem that Friday? Passover, the most important feast of the Jewish calendar. And God turned it into mourning. Not metaphorically, literally. Darkness fell over the city in the middle of Passover preparation. But there is a detail that is even more disturbing. Amos 8, verse 9 is not an isolated text. If you keep reading the context, Amos is denouncing merchants who exploit the poor and manipulate scales. And in the middle of that denunciation, God says, I will cause the sun to set at noon, as if judgment came disguised as midday. When everyone thinks they are safe because it is daytime, when everything seems normal, when people are buying and selling and going about their business. And that is exactly how the darkness arrived in Jerusalem, without warning, in full normalcy, in the middle of the feast. Joel 2 verse 10 adds another layer. The earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. Joel connects darkness with earthquake, the two signs together, exactly as it happened at Golgotha. Now think about it for a second. If you were in Jerusalem that midday, buying the lamb for dinner, preparing the unleavened bread, and suddenly the sky turned black as night at 12 noon, what would you think? Any Jew who knew his scriptures would have thought one single thing: judgment. God is judging. And they were right. But they were wrong about the object of the judgment. He was not judging Rome. He was not judging the Gentiles. He was judging sin, of all humanity, of all times, concentrated in a single body, nailed to a piece of wood. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21. For he hath made him to be sin for us who knew no sin. It doesn't say he made him a sinner. It says he made him sin. As if the entire toxic mass of human wickedness, every lie, every betrayal, every abuse, every murder, every corrupt thought of every human being who has ever existed and who will ever exist, had been compressed into a single point, and that point was the cross. And God could not look. The darkness was not a special effect to impress the crowd. It was the Father's response. It was God covering the scene, like a father who cannot watch what they are doing to his son, but at the same time, like the judge of the universe executing the heaviest sentence in history upon the only innocent one who ever lived. That is what God did with the darkness. It wasn't silence. It was a cosmic scream. If this is moving something inside you, hit like right now, because what comes next is even more powerful, and this is where the story gets really intense, because within those 3 hours of darkness, something happened that very few preach. Jesus stopped calling God Father. Think about this. Throughout his entire ministry, 3 full years, Jesus always addressed God as Father. In Gethsemane, hours before, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." Matthew 26:39. Already nailed to the cross at the beginning, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Luke 23:34. Father. Always Father. But in the darkest moment of the crucifixion at 3 in the afternoon, the cry that came out of his mouth was different. Matthew 27:46. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He changed from Father to my God. That change of word is the evidence of what was happening in the spiritual dimension. The relationship had been altered, not because God had stopped loving his Son, but because in that precise instant, the Son was carrying something that made intimacy impossible. He was carrying your sin and mine, and the sin of every human being. Isaiah 53 verse 10. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him, he hath put him to grief. That word in Hebrew, pleased, is shaphez, and it doesn't simply mean decided. It means it was pleasing to him, not because God enjoyed the suffering, but because the result, your freedom, my freedom, the reconciliation of all humanity, was so valuable that the price was worth paying. But for that to work, God had to do something he had never done in all eternity. Separate himself from his Son. Within the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, there had never been distance. From before the creation of the universe, that communion was perfect, uninterrupted, eternal. And on the cross, for the first time, it was broken. Jesus' cry was not theater. It wasn't a decorative quotation from Psalm 22. It was the sound of the most violent rupture in cosmic history. And the darkness over the earth was the visible reflection of that invisible separation. Now, if God had simply wanted to demonstrate power, the darkness alone would have been enough. But he didn't stop there, because what comes next is perhaps the most striking sign of all, and almost nobody understands what it really meant. Matthew 27, verse 51. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. You need to picture this to grasp the magnitude. The veil of the temple was not a decorative curtain. According to Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, it measured approximately 18 meters tall and 9 meters wide. That is like a 6-story building, and it was approximately 10 centimeters thick, the width of the palm of a hand. It was so heavy that, according to rabbinic tradition, 300 priests were needed to move it. It was made of finely twisted linen in blue, purple, and scarlet. Exodus 26, verse 31, and it had cherubim embroidered on it. The same cherubim God placed at the entrance of Eden after expelling Adam. Genesis 3:24, cherubim with flaming swords guarding the way to the tree of life. The veil of the temple was a replica of that barrier. It said the same thing the cherubim of Eden said, "You cannot pass, sin separates you." And God tore it, not from the bottom up, as a man pulling on it with force would do, from the top to the bottom, from 18 meters high, as if invisible hands had grabbed the upper part and ripped that thick fabric like someone tearing a rag. Do you understand what that means? Behind that veil was the most holy place, the most sacred space in all the earth, the only place where the direct presence of God dwelt. Nobody could enter there except the high priest, one single time a year on the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16:2. And if he entered without following the exact protocol, he died. Period. No negotiation. Tradition says the high priest entered with a rope tied to his ankle so his body could be pulled out if God struck him down. And the protocol was not simple. Leviticus 16 details every step. The high priest had to bathe, wear pure white linen, not the garments of glory he wore the rest of the year, but simple, humble clothing. He had to carry the blood of a bull sacrificed for his own sins first, then the blood of a goat for the sins of the people. He had to sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat, the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, 7 times. And while he was inside, a cloud of incense had to cover the mercy seat so that he would not die. Leviticus 16:13. That entire system, the sacrificed animal, the blood, the incense, the specific clothing, the washing, was necessary just so one man could be in the presence of God for a few minutes. And it had to be repeated every year, because animal sacrifices could not remove sin permanently. Hebrews 10:4. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and of goats should take away sins. And now think. That entire system ended in 1 second. When the veil tore, God declared obsolete everything he had commanded at Sinai 1,500 years earlier. Not because it had been wrong, but because it had been the shadow of something greater. And the greater thing had just arrived. Hebrews 10:1. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, that veil said, God is here, but you cannot approach. And in the exact moment when Jesus breathed his last breath, God destroyed the barrier. He didn't send an angel. He didn't wait for a ceremony. He didn't ask permission from the priests. He himself, with his own hands, metaphorically speaking, ripped the veil that he himself had commanded to be built 1,500 years before. Hebrews 10 verses 19 and 20 explains it. Having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he hath consecrated for us, through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. Did you catch the connection? The veil represented the flesh of Christ. When his body was destroyed on the cross, the veil tore. It was not coincidence. It was divine correspondence. What was happening at Golgotha and what was happening in the temple were the same thing seen from 2 angles. God was saying, the distance is over, the intermediary is over. The system of one man entering once a year with animal blood is over. From this second onward, any human being, Jew, Gentile, slave, free, man, woman, can enter directly into my presence through the blood of my Son. And if that doesn't give you chills, Think about what it meant for the priests who were inside the temple at that moment. It was 3 in the afternoon. They were preparing the evening sacrifice. The darkness had lasted 3 hours, and suddenly a sound like that of a giant fabric ripping. And in front of them, for the first time in their lives, the most holy place was exposed, open, without protection. Imagine the terror, because according to their theology, seeing the direct presence of God meant death. And now the veil was no longer there, but God did not kill them. That was the message. Death was no longer the answer to sin. Someone had already died for them, a few hundred meters away, on a hill called Golgotha. And the astonishing thing is that many of those priests understood. Acts 6 verse 7 says something extraordinary. And a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. Priests who saw the veil tear with their own eyes ended up believing in Jesus, because they had seen the signature of God in real time. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video right now, because what comes next is something almost nobody connects. Matthew 27 verse 51, second part. And the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. Now an earthquake in Jerusalem was not impossible. The region sits on the Dead Sea Transform Fault, part of the Great Rift Valley. Earthquakes occurred, but this earthquake was different for 3 reasons. First, its timing was supernatural. It happened in the exact instant of Jesus' death. Not minutes before, not hours after, in the precise moment. Second, the rocks split. Matthew uses the Greek word eskistesan, from which the word schist in geology comes. The rocks didn't crack on the surface. They split, they divided into fragments. Geologists who have examined rock formations near Golgotha in Jerusalem have found evidence of ancient seismic fractures consistent with an event of this type. Third, and this is the most striking, Phlegon of Thallus, the same pagan historian who recorded the darkness, also recorded this earthquake, and he placed it on the same date. A historian who had no interest in promoting Christianity confirmed that something catastrophic shook the region on that same day. But the most revealing thing is not the earthquake itself. It's what God was communicating with it. In the Old Testament, every time God manifests himself directly, the earth trembles. Exodus 19, verse 18. When God descended on Sinai to give the law, the whole mountain quaked violently. 1 Kings 19, verses 11 and 12. When God passed before Elijah, there was an earthquake. Psalm 18, verse 7. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken, because he was wroth. Do you see the pattern? Earthquake equals active presence of God, not absence. Presence. God was not far away while his son was dying. He was there, so close that the earth could not bear his weight. The earthquake at the Crucifixion was the physical response of the planet to what was happening in the spiritual dimension. Creation itself convulsed because its creator was executing the most costly act in all history. Romans 8, verse 22. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. Paul wrote that decades later, but that groaning began at Golgotha. The earth groaned when its creator was crucified. And here comes something you have probably never heard in a sermon, because the next sign is the strangest of all, and it is the one least preached. Matthew 27, verses 52 and 53. And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. Read that again. Dead people rose, not on the day of Jesus' resurrection. The graves opened at the moment of his death. The earth trembled, the rocks split, and the tombs carved into those rocks opened, and bodies of people who had been dead for years, perhaps centuries, rose. Matthew says they appeared unto many, not one, not two, many in Jerusalem, walking through the streets, people whom the living recognized, saints of the Old Testament who had died waiting for the Messiah. Can you imagine what that was like? You are in Jerusalem. You have spent 3 hours in total darkness. An earthquake has just shaken the city, and suddenly people you buried, people you saw die, are walking down your street, speaking to you, looking you in the eyes. This is what almost nobody explains. Why? Why did God raise dead people at that moment? What was he communicating? 1 Corinthians 15 verse 20 has the answer. But now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. The word first fruits comes from the Israelite agricultural system. Leviticus 23 verse 10. When you harvested your field, the first ears of grain, the first fruits, were presented to God as a guarantee that the rest of the harvest would come. The first fruits were not the end. They were the promise of the beginning. The dead who rose in Jerusalem were the first fruits, the first harvest, the visible proof that death had just been defeated, not in theory, not as a metaphor, physically, literally. Dead people getting up from their tombs and walking among the living. And there is a detail in the text that almost nobody notices. Matthew says that they came out of the graves after his resurrection. That is, the tombs opened on Friday, when Jesus died. But the dead did not come out until Sunday, after Jesus rose. Jesus had to rise first. He was the first fruits of the first fruits, the first to break the barrier of death. And only after he crossed it could the others follow him. It's like an armored door. Someone has to open it first, and only then can the others pass through. Jesus opened the door on Sunday, and the saints of the Old Testament, who had been waiting in their tombs for centuries, finally crossed. Think about what it must have been like. Someone walking through the streets of Jerusalem on Resurrection Sunday, still processing Friday's earthquake, still disturbed by the 3 hours of darkness. And suddenly, he sees a face he recognizes, a grandfather, a local prophet, a righteous man who had died years before, alive, standing, looking at him. It was not a ghostly apparition. Matthew uses the word appeared, enephanistison, which implies physical, visible, verifiable manifestation. These people were not floating among the clouds. They were walking through the streets, and that raises a question few dare to ask. Who were they? Matthew says saints who had slept. In biblical language, saints refers to the faithful, those who lived trusting in God's promises. Abraham, Moses, David. The text doesn't specify, but it does say the people recognized them. So they were probably recent saints, people the living generation still remembered, perhaps pious rabbis, perhaps Maccabean martyrs, people who died waiting for the Messiah and whom God raised so they could see with their own eyes that the Messiah had arrived. God did not limit himself to killing the darkness, tearing the veil, and shaking the earth. He reversed death itself in real time, a few hundred meters from where his son was nailed to a piece of wood. And notice something. Today, when someone loses a loved one, what they want most is to see them once more, to embrace them once more, to hear their voice once more. That Friday in Jerusalem, God did exactly that for dozens of families. He gave them back their dead. Not permanently. The final resurrection still waits. But temporarily, as a sample, as a preview, as if God were saying what just happened on that cross guarantees that what you are seeing, your dead one alive, will be permanent one day. For everyone. Forever. That is what God did when he saw the crucifixion. He didn't stand with his arms crossed. He didn't watch from a distance. Each sign was a deliberate action, precise and loaded with centuries of prophecy fulfilled in a single Friday. If this is changing the way you see the cross, subscribe to the channel, because the sign that connects it all is still to come. There is something that usually goes unnoticed in the middle of all these cosmic signs. Something small, almost insignificant compared to darkness, earthquakes, and dead people rising. But when you understand it, it is perhaps the most devastating of all. Luke 23, verse 45, has a detail that most translations treat as a repetition of Matthew. It says the sun was darkened and the veil of the temple was torn in the middle. But Luke adds something Matthew doesn't say. Luke says the sun was darkened, using the Greek word eklipontos, which literally means to fail or to abandon. The sun was not blocked. It failed. It was extinguished. And that word is the one that connects with something that happened 700 years earlier and that nobody preaches. Zephaniah 1, verse 15. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Zephaniah was describing the day of the Lord, the day of final judgment. And every detail he described, darkness, distress, devastation, was fulfilled in miniature at Golgotha. The day of the Lord was not only a future event, it had a preview, a dress rehearsal, and it was the Friday of the Crucifixion. And this is where it gets even deeper. Because if you look at all of chapter 1 of Zephaniah, it says something in verse 18 that leaves you cold. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath. Nobody could buy their way out of judgment. No human sacrifice was enough. No animal offering was permanent. The price was too high for any creature. And who paid? The Creator himself. That changes everything, because it means that when God wrapped the cross in darkness, he wasn't simply reacting to the suffering of his Son. He was executing a cosmic judgment, the same judgment the prophets had announced for centuries. But instead of falling upon guilty humanity, as Zephaniah warned, it fell upon the only innocent one. And God did not do it because it was easy. He did it because it was necessary. Romans 3:25 through 26 says that God presented Jesus as a propitiation, that he might be just, and the justifier of him which believeth in Jesus. God had a problem, if you can call it that. He was perfectly just and perfectly loving. Justice demanded punishment, love demanded forgiveness, and the cross was the only solution that satisfied both at the same time. The punishment fell, but on the Son. Forgiveness flowed toward humanity. Justice and love met on a piece of wood on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and the price was paid by the judge. Isaiah 53, verse 5. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. The crucifixion was the day of judgment brought forward, but the accused was God himself incarnate, and the verdict, guilty, was pronounced by the Father upon the Son who never sinned, so that the verdict over you and over me would be acquitted. Do you understand now why the signs were so terrifying? They were not dramatic decoration. They were the markers of divine judgment, the same signs that will accompany the end of times. Darkness, earthquakes, resurrections took place at Golgotha 2,000 years earlier. As a preview, as a sample, as irrefutable evidence that what was happening on that cross was not just another Roman execution. It was the central event of all human history. And there was one person at Golgotha who understood it all without having the Hebrew scriptures, without knowing Amos, without having read Zephaniah, without knowing anything about the veil of the temple. Matthew 27, verse 54. Now when the centurion and they that were with him watching Jesus saw the earthquake and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, Truly this was the Son of God. Mark adds a detail that Matthew omits. Mark 15:39. And when the centurion, which stood over against him, saw that he so cried out and gave up the ghost, he said, Truly this man was the Son of God. Mark specifies that the centurion was looking at him face on, face to face, standing right in front of the cross. This man was a Roman soldier, a pagan. He probably worshipped the emperor as God. He had carried out who knows how many crucifixions before. For him, this was just another job, another Jewish criminal, another afternoon in Judea. A Roman centurion commanded 80 soldiers. He was a hardened man. He had seen dozens, perhaps hundreds of people die. He knew the sound bones make when the hammer drives a 15-centimeter iron nail through a wrist. He knew the screams. He knew the curses the condemned hurled at their executioners. He knew the smell of blood and sweat under the Judean sun. And he knew exactly how long a crucified man took to die, sometimes days, literally. Crucifixion didn't kill through blood loss or through the wounds. It killed through positional asphyxiation. The hanging body compressed the lungs, and the crucified person had to push himself up with the nails in his feet to breathe. Each breath was an act of torture, until the muscles failed and he could no longer lift himself, and he suffocated in his own position. But Jesus did not die like that. Jesus died shouting, with force. After only 6 hours, not the 2 or 3 days the crucified usually lasted, and instead of simply stopping breathing, he pronounced a phrase, "It is finished," and voluntarily handed over his spirit, like someone placing an object in the hands of another. Luke 23:46. "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. The centurion had seen many men die, but he had never seen anyone decide when to die. Nobody controls the moment of their death on a cross, except this man. But something shifted. The darkness rattled him. The earthquake scared him. And the way Jesus died, not writhing in agony like the others, but handing over his spirit voluntarily, shouting with force when he should have been too weak to whisper, broke him inside. John 19, verse 30. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. The Greek word is tetelestai. It comes from teleo, which means to complete, to finish, to bring something to its absolute end. It's not an "it's over" of defeat. It's an "it is completed" of mission accomplished. Tetelestai, finished, fulfilled, nothing pending. Jesus did not die as a victim. He died like someone signing a receipt, done, paid, nothing outstanding. And that Roman soldier who knew nothing about prophecies or theology saw all of that and came to the right conclusion before most theologians did. Truly, this man was the Son of God. You know what is most striking about that? That the first confession of faith after the cross did not come from a disciple. It did not come from Peter, who had denied him 3 times. It did not come from John, who was at the foot of the cross. It came from an enemy soldier, from the representative of the empire that had just executed Jesus. God orchestrated the signs in such a way that even a pagan understood. The darkness spoke a universal language. The earthquake spoke a universal language. The supernatural death of a man who controlled the moment of his own death spoke a language that needed no translation. Now, before we reach the end, I need you to see something that brings all the signs into a single picture, because seen separately, they are striking. But seen together, they form a pattern that is impossible to ignore. The darkness was the judgment. The torn veil was the access. The earthquake was the presence. The split rocks were the rupture of the old system. The risen dead were the victory over death. The centurion's confession was the extension to the Gentiles. Each sign pointed in a different direction, to a different audience. The darkness was for the Jews. They knew what darkness at noon meant. They recognized the prophetic language. Amos, Joel, Zephaniah. Every Jew educated in the Torah must have connected the dots. The torn veil was for the priests. They were the only ones who understood the weight of that curtain. They knew what the exposed most holy place meant. They knew something had just changed forever in the relationship between God and humanity. The earthquake was for everyone. You didn't need to be a Jew or a priest to understand that the earth was shaking. The earthquake was the democratic sign, the one that reached every person in Jerusalem regardless of their position, their education, or their faith. The risen dead were for the skeptics, for those who could doubt darkness. Maybe it was a storm, or the earthquake, maybe it was natural. But dead people walking through the streets? That is not explained by geology or by meteorology. That requires a power that transcends the laws of nature. And the centurion's confession was for the Gentiles, for everyone who wasn't Jewish, for the Roman world, for you and for me. A pagan declared what the disciples had not yet processed. And his confession was recorded in Scripture as proof that the cross was not only for Israel, it was for all humanity. God left no one without a witness that Friday. Each group received its sign, each sign had its audience, and all of them together formed a single message. What just happened on this cross has no precedent and has no reverse. The world has just changed forever. There is something more you need to know. And this is what left me speechless when I discovered it. The signs of the crucifixion are exactly the same signs that accompanied the giving of the law at Sinai. Exactly the same. And when you put them side by side, you discover something that changes forever the way you read the Bible. Look at the comparison. Sinai, Exodus 19. Thick darkness covered the mountain. Golgotha, Matthew 27. Darkness covered the earth. Sinai, the whole mountain trembled violently. Golgotha, the earth trembled and the rocks split. Sinai, God descended in fire, smoke and thick cloud. Golgotha, God tore the veil that separated his presence. Sinai, the people were forbidden to come near. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall be surely put to death. Exodus 19:13. Golgotha, God opened the access, having boldness to enter. Hebrews 10:19. Sinai, the law was written on tablets of stone. Golgotha, the stones split, as if the tablets of the law themselves had broken, because the law had just been fulfilled and no longer condemned. Sinai, Moses had to intercede so that God would not destroy the people. Exodus 32:11 through 14. Golgotha, Jesus interceded from the cross. Father, forgive them. Luke 23:34. Moses begged for forgiveness from a mountain. Jesus bought forgiveness from another mountain, and the price was infinitely greater. At Sinai, God gave the law that condemned. At Golgotha, God fulfilled the law that condemned. The same signs, the same God, but opposite purposes. At Sinai, the signs said, "Stay away because you are a sinner, and my presence will destroy you." At Golgotha, the signs said, "Come close, because someone has just paid the price you owed." And there is something else in this comparison that almost no one sees. In Exodus 24, verses 3 through 8, Moses sealed the covenant between God and Israel by sprinkling blood on the people. "This is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord hath made with you." Now listen to what Jesus said the night before the crucifixion at the Last Supper. Matthew 26:28. "For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." Do you see the structure? Moses sprinkled the blood of animals to seal the old covenant. Jesus poured out his own blood to seal the new covenant. And the signs that accompanied both covenants were identical: darkness, earthquake, supernatural presence, because it was the same God signing a new contract, with the same cosmic pen, but with different ink. The first time, it was the blood of calves and goats. The second time, it was the blood of God incarnate. That is the most monumental inversion in spiritual history. The God who shook the earth to drive men away, shook the earth to bring them near. And there is the complete answer to the question we asked at the beginning. What did God do when he saw the crucifixion of his Son? He turned off the sun to declare judgment. He tore the veil to open the access. He shook the earth to declare his presence. He split the rocks to break the old system. He raised the dead to demonstrate victory. And he turned an enemy soldier into the first confessor of the new era. Each sign was a sentence, and together they form the most important paragraph ever written, not on papyrus or parchment, but in the darkened sky, in the destroyed veil, in the earth that opened, and in the dead who walked. God was not passive on the cross. The cross was his idea, his plan, his price, and the signs were his signature. You know, sometimes we get so used to the story of the cross that we forget what actually happened. We hear about it at Easter, we see it in movies, we read it on cards with pretty verses, and we turn it into something familiar, domestic, safe. But there was nothing safe about that Friday. An innocent man was tortured to death by the most powerful empire on earth, while the God who could have stopped it with a single word chose not to. And instead of stopping it, he doubled down. He turned off the sun, tore his own house, shook the planet, and raised the dead. Not to prevent the death of his Son, but to give cosmic meaning to that death. Imagine for a moment that you are a father or a mother, and you see your child suffering. Every instinct in your body tells you to intervene. Rescue him, get him out of there. Now imagine that instead of rescuing him, you choose to let him suffer, not out of indifference, not out of weakness, but because you know that suffering is the only way to save billions of people who haven't been born yet, people your son will never meet, people who perhaps will not even thank him for what he did, but you decide it is worth it, that his pain is worth it, that the price is worth it. That is what God did. John 3:16 does not say, "For God so loved the world that he rescued his only Son." It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." Gave, handed over, released, let go. And while he was letting him go, he did not stay silent. He spoke, but not with words. He spoke with darkness, with earthquake, with a destroyed veil, with the dead rising. He spoke the most brutal and most beautiful language that has ever existed, the language of a father who pays the highest price in the universe to recover children who are not even looking for him. But there is one more thing, the last one, and perhaps the most important. After the darkness, after the veil, after the earthquake, after the dead, there was silence. Matthew doesn't record it, but the silence is there. Between the lines, Jesus had already died. The signs had ceased, and Jerusalem was left in a supernatural silence. That silence lasted until Sunday. 3 days, the same number as the hours of darkness. 3 hours of darkness, 3 days in the tomb, and on the third day the definitive sign, the one that confirmed that everything before was not tragedy but strategy, not defeat but victory, not the end but the beginning. But that is another story. What you need to remember today is this: the darkest Friday in history was the day God worked the hardest. Each sign was an act, each act was a message, and each message had a recipient, you. The darkness is gone. The veil was never sewn back together. The earth stopped trembling. The dead went back to sleep, waiting for the final resurrection. But the access God opened that Friday is still open, right now. While you listen to this, Hebrews 4:16, "Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." That throne was behind a veil 18 meters tall, guarded by cherubim of embroidered thread, protected by a sacrificial system that was 1,500 years old. And God destroyed it in a second, so that you could come close, without a priest, without a ritual, without a sacrificed animal, only with the blood of his Son. That is what God did when he saw the crucifixion, and he did it for you. There is a video on the screen right now that will reveal something that connects directly with what we just discovered, something that happened in the 3 days between the cross and the empty tomb, and that most believers have never heard. If you made it this far, what follows will leave you speechless. Click.